Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew, and in this video we're going to be looking at an ethnic group that officially does not exist in Russia, though in reality they have lingered on the periphery for a very long time, the Ainu. The Ainu, or Aina in their indigenous tongue, are a small community divided between Russia and Japan. For the purpose of this video, we will be touching upon Japan, but primarily talking about the Ainu in Russia, despite the fact the majority of Ainu do live in Japan. Getting information on the Ainu has been particularly tricky, as historically the Russian Federation has claimed there are no living Ainu in their country since the Second World War, and thus they are not counted in census information, nor were they during the Soviet years. However, since the 1980s, there has been an active effort to recognise the Ainu as an ethnic group in Russia, and activists have recorded themselves manually onto census data in the last few censuses. There are a recorded 300 Ainu residing in the Russian Federation, with perhaps thousands more unaware of their heritage. This point will be explained later in the video. The Ainu, sometimes called Kyrills in Russian, can be found in the Sakhalin Oblast, the Kamchatka Krai, and the Khabarovsk Krai. Their name comes from the Ainu word for human or being, as opposed to spirit. There are no sub-ethnos groups for the Ainu, and whilst they traditionally resided in clans, the low numbers have led to a geographical distinction between the Ainu rather than anything based on dialect or clan affiliations. As such, all 300 Ainu in the Russian Federation fall into the Russian Ainu branch of the Ainu community. As mentioned before, this community is dwarfed by those in Japan. Whilst the Ainu do have their own language, it is not widely spoken in Japan and has entirely died out within Russia. Thus, all Russian Ainu speak Russian or other Siberian languages for reasons we will explain later on. Aside from the very low numbers, one of the major obstacles to a revival of the Ainu language within Russia is the fact that they are not recognized as a people, meaning there is no official support for their language in a Cyrillic script. Whilst there are efforts to revitalize the language in Japan, they use a script based on Japanese characters there, meaning that any Ainu in Russia looking to relearn their native language would pretty much have to learn Japanese first. Due to the widespread nature of the Ainu, rather than one chronological history, I will be exploring the 4 prominent regions of Ainu settlement: Hokkaido, Sakhalin, Kuril Islands, and Kamchatka, starting with the least Russian one. Hokkaido is widely considered, perhaps with the Kurills, as the homeland of the Ainu, the very name Hokkaido containing the Ainu word for person. Spread across the wide island hunting and fishing in clans, the Ainu were perhaps first mentioned in the 9th century as the Izo, or barbarians to the Japanese. Having encountered the Japanese on the main island of Honshu, trading furs and fish for rice and iron, Hokkaido was an exclusively Ainu land for several centuries. But that does not mean it was isolated. The Ainu would grow to hold a peculiar place in East Asian trade relations, soon adopting technology and customs from both the Japanese and Chinese they encountered. In 1400, Japanese settlers of the Matsume clan arrived in Hokkaido, partly to avoid violence breaking out on the Japanese main islands. They landed in the south and began to compete with the natives for both land and resources. The superior technology and state support for the Japanese would lead them to dominate, and by 1457 power was very much tilted towards the Japanese. Ainu clans would trade valuable furs and pelts for access to iron tools and weapons, as well as Japanese textiles and staple crops such as rice. As more Japanese arrived on Hokkaido and their power grew, the Ainu did not just sit quietly by. Uprisings in both 1669 and 1789 broke out, but both were crushed by the Japanese at a huge loss of Ainu life. By the 18th century, a policy of cultural genocide was adopted by the Japanese state, marrying off the Ainu women to Japanese men and sending the Ainu men to die in the mines. In 1700, there had been an estimated 80,000 Ainu in Hokkaido. In 1868, a mere 15,000. 7 years later, the Treaty of St. Petersburg would be signed between Japan and Russia, demarking Hokkaido as exclusively Japanese territory. And that is where Hokkaido's involvement in our story is going to end. Now, there is a lot more to the Ainu story on Hokkaido, particularly after this point. But as this channel is all about Russia, not all about Japan, I will not go into it here. For those of you who are interested, I will leave a link which you can follow just over here. The Treaty of St. Petersburg agreed that Hokkaido was exclusively Japanese territory, but it also decided something else. It agreed that the island to the north, Sakhalin, was exclusively Russian territory, and this was an island the Ainu knew very well. The island of Sakhalin is north of Hokkaido, and the Ainu had settled there around the 9th century AD, primarily in the south. Sakhalin was not uninhabited, and the Orok and Niv communities that had lived there since time immemorial were moved north by the invading Ainu. Why the Ainu settled on the island of Sakhalin is something of a mystery. It might have been a reaction to escaping conflicts on the Japanese mainland to the south. It might have simply been a population seeking new food sources. Whatever the reason, in the 9th century onward, the Ainu began advancing, effectively controlling the entire south of the island. The Ainu who arrived were not a peaceful people, and this would prove to be something of a problem, particularly when they met their match in the form of the Mongols. The Mongols had become the overlord of the Nivk and the Orok in 1263, and as part of that arrangement were obliged to defend them from all external threats. Threats like the Ainu. The Ainu and the Mongols would play cat and mouse, raiding and retreating right up until 1296, when a peace treaty was signed. The peace treaty was an enormous success for both the Mongols and the Ainu, as it stopped the raiding and gave the Ainu what they actually wanted: access to the Chinese market. Iron tools, Chinese silks and rice all flooded Ainu communities, who traded animal pelts and fish in return. Even after the Mongols fell to the Ming, this trade arrangement continued and would have a profound effect on the Ainu. In fact, this trade would have a profound effect on the whole island of Sakhalin. Intermarriage with the Nivk and Orok peoples would then extend the Ainu language to the whole of the island, whilst Chinese culture and holidays began to be adopted by the Ainu who lived there, modelling their own communities on the Ming they encountered. With this trade came peace, and the Ainu on Sakhalin would prosper right up until the 17th century. Stability in neighbouring Japan meant an expansion of their borders, and in 1635 Japanese explorers landed on the island, bringing reports of Ainu living there. 5 years later, this was actually recreated by a Russian Cossack explorer, Vasily Poyarkov, who identified the trading opportunities there, being closer and perhaps more motivated to, first in 1679, but again more successfully in the 1780s. These settlements were not so much for actual colonization, more to extort silk from the Ainu. The Japanese were almost Cossack in this approach, being extremely brutal and trading at a very different ratio. As trade had been free-flowing for quite a long time, the Ainu and Sakhalin had become less self-dependent and more reliant on trade with others, particularly in regards to food. Thus, when the Japanese arrived from the Matsume clan, they were extremely brutal in their trade, often withholding necessary food supplies until enough silk had been raised. This caused great unrest across the island, as the Ainu took to borrowing and even stealing silk from other communities to merit these trades. Even after the Japanese state took over this trade, disgusted at how brutal the Matsume had been, their plight only diminished a little bit, and many Ainu left for safer lands, particularly in the Kurils. Sakhalin would change hands multiple times between the 19th and 20th centuries, and this is something that we will explore more in our video on the Sakhalin Oblast. However, for now, all we really need to know is that both under Japanese and under Russian ownership, things went badly for the Ainu. Indigenization saw a cultural genocide of the Ainu, a brutal and systematic campaign to force the Aboriginals to blend in with the Yamato masses. This was characterized by discrimination, sexual abuse, and enslavement, and would decimate the Ainu population. Under Russian rule, integration of the Ainu was simply not a large concern, and they were treated largely as natives, that is to say, officially citizens, but without any state support whatsoever. Used as cheap labour in support of the penal colony established there, the various illnesses that swept from such places affected the Ainu clans remaining, and brought their numbers down to 3 digits. Intervention and war saw the Ainu population plummet, and in 1945, when the Soviet Union invaded South Sakhalin, around 400 Ainu still resided there. A year later, only 152 were registered on the entire island. This brings us to quite a sad but curious part of the story. Never truly a Japanese people, going so far as having allied themselves with the Russians in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, the Sakhalin Ainu were mistrusted by the Russians as potential spies and collaborators. As such, when the Soviets took control of the entire island, many Ainu, along with Koreans, were interned in gulags, expelled along with the Japanese, or even outright murdered. What is more, the actual mention of Ainu as a nationality was struck from the official record, with no further Ainu permitted to identify themselves as such, being labelled Kamchadals or other nationalities. This might seem an unusual decision, but there was a twisted logic to it. During their imperial period, the Japanese had claimed the Ainu as Japanese citizens, and had claimed that wherever the Ainu had settled was rightful Japanese territory. As early as the late Tsarist period, the Ainu had been renamed to Kurils to avoid any potential Japanese claims to the Far East. When the Second World War ended, the Soviet Union had occupied many areas that, historically, had been in the Japanese Empire, and thus a quick and easy way to stop any potential claims to that land being given back was to deny anyone still there. Ainu left on Sakhalin were Sovietized, given Slavicized names and rebranded as mixed-race Eurasians under the blanket term Kamchatal. One of the places this was also done, and for exactly the same reason, were the Kuril Islands. The Kuril Islands stretch from Hokkaido up to Kamchatka and had been home to the Ainu since recorded history. Their very name, originally the Kairils, suggests an Ainu connection, and perhaps were colonized from Hokkaido in early history. It is also worth mentioning that it might be the other way round, whereas the Kuril Islands are actually the homeland and everywhere else colonized from there. What we do know is that the Kurils are fairly isolated from the rest of Asia, and thus the Ainu were, for the longest time, apart from any interference there. Different islands hosted different clans, though their relationship to each other is not entirely known to us. Japanese sources suggest they have been aware of the islands since at least 1603, but in practice the Kurils were simply too far and too poor to be worth colonizing. This is something that would go on to change quite quickly. Dutch explorers in 1643, Russian Cossacks in 1711, and Anglo-American whalers in 1847 brought the modern world crashing onto the shores of the Ainu. Their location and potential fishing rights made them an attractive prospect to both the Russian and Japanese governments as time went on. We will explain this more in our video on the Sakhalin Oblast, but for now, all we really need to know is that in that Treaty of St. Petersburg, the entire Kuril chain was put under Japanese jurisdiction, and the Ainu living there, Japanese subjects. This is significant as it spurred two very important consequences for the Ainu people. The Japanese did not want a barbarian people on these islands, and went through great pains to Japanize the Ainu and the Kurils. This included preventing the Ainu taking to sea, enforcing Japanese custom and language across the islands, as well as a cultural genocide, deporting the men and marrying off the women. This policy was incredibly effective. In 1941, the last Ainu were moved away from the Kurils and taken to Japan, as they were naturalized Japanese citizens, ahead of the militarization of the Kurils, ending a culture that had been there for many thousands of years. The second important consequence of this Japanese colonization is that it encouraged those in the very northern islands to look elsewhere for somewhere far away from the Japanese, somewhere safer, to move to Kamchatka. The Ainu had been fishing and hunting in the southern coast of Kamchatka since at least the 17th century, but it's very likely they had been there for hundreds of years beforehand. The distance between Kamchatka and the northernmost Kuril Islands is not a huge distance. However, the seas are quite choppy, making regular travel quite difficult. In 1667, Russian Cossacks arrived in Kamchatka and encountered the Ainu in the south of the peninsula. And based on what we know about Cossacks from our video on the Cossacks, which you can watch over here, how do you think that encounter went? If you said they demanded Yasek and started killing them, then you're absolutely right. And this would colour the Ainu's perception of the Russians for some time after. Changing imperial policy in the 18th century brought a reconciliation, where the Ainu and Kamchatka traded their furs and fish for metal tools and fabricated textiles. Kamchatka was and is one of the most remotest parts of Russia, but this actually worked in favour of the Ainu. Centred around Lake Kuril, the Ainu population were pretty much left alone for most of the 18th and 19th centuries, their population actually increasing slightly from exiles from the Kurils. The end of Tsarism and the dawn of the Soviet Union saw increased traffic in this area. Exclusively Ainu villages were closed and the population moved to make more efficient mixed communities, where the Ainu were given a new name, Kamchadals. As we mentioned earlier, renaming the Ainu to something else was a policy started in Tsarist times, but it went to the nth degree under the Soviet system. Not legally able to identify themselves and growing up with a plethora of other Soviet peoples in their communities, the Ainu of Kamchatka inevitably mixed, and when the Soviet thaw came in the late 1980s, there were few, if any, pure-blooded Ainu left in Kamchatka, or in Russia for that matter. To put this in context, official Soviet policy up until 1970 was to flat out deny the Ainu existed in their country. This was only repealed in the 1970s. It was only after this censorship went away that communities started to explore their own histories. Since the 2000s, dozens of Russians have been discovering their Ainu roots, and a low-level campaign for recognition on the federal level does exist. Recognition as an ethnic group of the Russian Federation does come with some perks and advantages, notably around fishing and hunting. As such, even though the Ainu community is very small, the federal government have been reluctant to accept that they exist, because they would have to forfeit some rights and privileges to yet another community. In neighbouring Japan, the Ainu situation is much brighter, with at least a state recognition of the people existing there. Usually in these videos, we explore the religious makeup, the cultural festivals, and the food of each ethnic group. But in the case of the Ainu, this is rather difficult to do. Not only are there so few Ainu left in Russia, but almost none of them adhere to any traditional Ainu customs or belief, the results of many years of Sovietization. In fact, the Russian Ainu face a massive problem in that there is no collective village memory to draw upon, many of their ancestors being Russified, going back over 100 years or more. And yet, there is still hope. On Hokkaido, the Ainu there have created something of a rebirth, with traditional villages being created to explore and practice some of their own traditions. Whilst the traditional bear baiting ceremony of Lomante has been banned since 2007, other practices, such as anchipiri, or facial tattooing on women, creating and wearing traditional clothes such as the atusi robes, or the preparation of native dishes such as ohao, a meat stew, and rataske, an oily plate of mixed meat and vegetables, does happen in Hokkaido, and perhaps one day they will in Russia as well. Thank you for watching. My name is Andrew. Paka!